We will begin the first session. Dr. David W.C. MACMILLAN will give the first lecture in the 15th HOPE meeting. This HOPE meeting has 7 Japanese researchers who are acting as moderators. They are assigned to moderate each lecture and group discussion sessions. Dr. Kazunori Nagao from Kyoto University will be the moderator of this session. Please welcome Dr. Nagao.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of this 15th HOPE meeting with Nobel Laureates. The speaker for the first lecture is Professor David W.C. MACMILLAN. He is a distinguished chemistry professor in Princeton University. Professor MACMILLAN is one of the Nobel laureates in chemistry 2021 for the development of asymmetric organocatalysis. The organocatalysis uses a small organic molecule as catalyst instead of metals or enzymes. He also developed the photoredox catalysis, which can utilize the light energy into the chemical energy. His achievement enabled to access complex and variable organic molecule from abundant molecule in environmentally benign manner. He will give us 45 lecture, and we have 15 minutes for the Q&A. His talk title is The Path to Invention and Discovery in Catalysis. I was working as postdoc in his lab from 2016 to 2018. So it is an honor for me to introduce him as his alumni. I'm looking up to Dave as a scientist and also the humorous person. So he told me, during my stay in Princeton, he told me one presentation with 1 joke. So maybe he will tell us an interesting joke. So please join me to welcome Professor MACMILLAN.
Okay, thank you, Kazunori. Professor Nagao was a postdoc in my lab from Japan, and he came over, and while he was in my group, he actually had 2 science papers. So I keep telling people from Japan, please send me more Kazunori Nagao. That would be very, very helpful. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the organizers, to the president, for the chance to be here today. Meetings like this are very rare. They don't happen very often, and it's always a tremendous privilege and honor to be part of them. I'm a relatively new Nobel Prize winner, and I get to be around many distinguished Nobel Prize winners and many distinguished scientists. And I find at these meetings, I learn an enormous amount from all of these people. So I and my wife are very, very happy to be here. So thank you for the chance, and I hope to get a chance to talk with all of you. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about some research, but I'm going to tell you about the work that led to winning the Nobel Prize. This is not really a lot of the work that we're doing right now, but I think for a general audience like this one, it's a better story to learn about what we were working on. So first thing is I have to tell you who I am, and a question that everyone asks me, especially in America, is where are you from? So I always like to show people this is where I'm from. This is Scotland. You might feel insulted that many of you know where Scotland is, and I apologize for showing you where Scotland is, but no one in America knows where Scotland is. So I always like to show this map. Scotland is here. In Japan, it's very famous because of whiskey. It's very popular in Japan, and many Japanese people like whiskey. I very much like sake, so I think that's a good reciprocal arrangement. People often say, how will I remember where Scotland is? And I always tell them there's a very easy way to remember where Scotland is. Scotland is always on top of England. It's very, very simple thing to remember. There'll be a couple of those jokes along the way. Okay, so I grew up in this town called, just outside of Glasgow, which is called Belsill. It's a place where it's famous for steel working. My father was a steel worker, and I grew up there. Now, this is a photograph of where I'm from. This is the council house where we grew up in. And this is my family, a long time ago. Well, we grew up in a working class family. We did not have much money, but every day we felt very wealthy, very rich, because every day we would enjoy great humor, great jokes, and have fun in how we interacted with each other. I was very, very lucky to have that childhood. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why am I showing you photographs of me as a baby? Well, the reason is, after I won the Nobel Prize people contacted me and said, can you send us photographs of you as a baby? And I said, why? And they said, well, we want to put it on the Nobel Prize website. I said, but that's got nothing to do with my scientific contributions. But they said, we don't care, we want to put this on the website. So I went to my house with my wife, and we looked everywhere, could not find any photographs. So I contacted my sister, who was back in Scotland, and she went and found these 3 photographs of me as a baby, and they are now on the Nobel Prize website. But I've come to realize that this is one of the greatest jokes, one of the greatest practical jokes I think has ever been played, because I realized this is not me. This is my sister. And so she has confessed to this recently that her photograph is now on the Nobel Prize website. Okay, so when I was younger, my brother Ian decided to do something pretty remarkable. He decided that he wanted to go to university. Now, you may think, why is that remarkable? Well, it was remarkable because in our town and in our school, no one had ever gone to university before, and it was quite controversial. And it was controversial with my mom and my dad because they thought he was just being lazy and trying to avoid going to the steelworks, which was probably true. But he went off to get a degree, and he got a degree in physics. And the day after he got his degree, he got a job. And the salary that job paid, it paid more money than what my father made after 30 years in the steelworks. And at that moment, my mother and my father came to see me and said, you have to go to university. So the biggest professional career decision of my life was made for me. And so off I went to university, to Glasgow. And the formula was to do physics, because my brother did physics. But very quickly, I realized I was terrible at physics. I was very, very bad at physics. And so fortunately, though, at the same time, I had to take courses in chemistry. And I realized I loved organic chemistry. And I joined this group. It was a fantastic group. And I graduated back in 1989. Now, at the end, I had to do a PhD. I realized I really wanted to keep learning about chemistry. And I realized I wanted to go to America because I liked American TV programs, I liked American movies, I liked American sport. And so I decided what I would do. This was before computers, this was before email and the internet. And I saved up and I bought these envelopes and I sent off 18 letters to 18 different people in America with absolutely no reply. And then the 19th letter I sent off, I'd almost given up, and I received a reply, and it was from this gentleman, whose name was Hal Moore, who's a chemist, dean, and founder of the UCI faculty. And he said to me, you cannot be accepted into America to do a PhD by writing a letter. So he sent me an application form. So he sent me this application form back in 1988. I filled it out, and I was accepted. And I left Scotland on a raining Tuesday morning, and I landed in Los Angeles on a very warm evening. And I remember landing and going around and trying to find a place to stay. I had to find a place to stay. And the woman who was taking me around showed me an apartment complex. And she showed it to me and said, look, here we have an apartment complex that has 4 tennis courts, it has 6 swimming pools, and it has 8 jacuzzis. And I said, what is a jacuzzi? And she explained to me it's a big hole in the ground with hot water, and you can drink beer on a Friday night. And I enjoyed that enormously. So that was off I went. Okay, so let's jump ahead in this story to the actual science part. And this is when I found out with Ben List that we had won the 2021 Chemistry Nobel Prize. And we won it for this thing called asymmetric organocatalysis. And one question people always ask is what on earth does this mean? So I'm going to walk you through this. And many of you are scientists, most of you are scientists, you probably know what catalysis is. But one of the questions is, why do we need catalysis? This is a photograph of my office in Princeton, but you can look around this room right now, and you realize that absolutely everything around you is made by a chemical reaction. Everything we can see with our eyes right now is made by a chemical reaction. So if I focus in on one of these, so this one here, this is my coffee cup, and I focus in on this chemical reaction. This is the chemical reaction to make caffeine. As it happens, most chemical reactions are not spontaneous. Most of them require energy. And the way that we show this as chemists, without becoming too technical, is we use an energy diagram to reveal what is involved in any given chemical reaction. Now, when I'm teaching to high school students or to people who are not chemists, how do you think about this energy? I always say, imagine that every day when you're going home, that you have to walk over a large hill. To walk over that hill every day would require a large amount of energy. But imagine that you could introduce a tunnel to go home every day. That would make it so much easier. And that is exactly what catalysis does. It makes it so much easier to perform chemical reactions. In fact, it makes existing reactions easier and faster, but most importantly, it allows new chemical reactions that were previously impossible to become possible. Okay, so you might ask, is catalysis important to our world? And I think I can show you that is true. First of all, this is the global population over time, over 2,000 years, and it's pretty stable for a long period of time. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, there's an inflection point, and it grows to 8 billion people, where we now are. As it happens, you could not have 8 billion people on the planet without this one catalytic reaction, the conversion of nitrogen into ammonia. So why is it so important? Well, it's so important because we need that catalytic reaction to make food. We would not have enough food for 8 billion people without this one catalytic reaction. And one of my favorite statistics around this, if you think about your body, you think about your DNA, your protein, all of those molecules in your body that contain nitrogen, 50% of those nitrogen atoms actually come from a factory in Germany. That's incredible. That's an incredible statistic. Okay, so the other part of this is that 90% of industrial scale chemical reactions use catalysis. 35% of the world's global GDP at the present time is based on catalysis, and that number is only going to keep increasing as we move forward. Okay, so the second thing is, what about asymmetric? What does asymmetric mean? Well, this is actually pretty easy to understand even if you're not an organic chemist, because you can look at your hands. And if you look at your hands right now, you can ask them, are they identical? They kind of look like they are identical, but you realize there's a difference between them. They are, in fact, mirror images of each other. And we know they're different from each other because we know if you take the glove from your left hand and you try to put it on your right hand, you know it doesn't fit. It doesn't recognize your hand. So they're similar, but they're different. That's called asymmetric, the mirror image non-superimposability. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because this happens in chemistry and in organic chemistry a lot. So for example, here are two molecules which are in fact mirror images of each other. Now, if I was to go into a lab and try and tell these two molecules apart from each other, it would involve a very expensive piece of equipment, and it would take me about 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes, to tell those molecules apart. However, if I was to take a 3-year-old child, and this is a photograph of my daughter, Emma, when she was just 3 years old. She's not much bigger, but she's 18 years old now. But even when she was 3 years old, she could tell these apart in a microsecond. And she could do that simply by smelling them. And if you smell them, one of them smells like caraway, and the other one actually smells like spearmint. People often ask me, what does caraway smell like? And I always say it smells a bit like spearmint, to be perfectly honest. They're pretty similar to each other, but you can tell them apart. But the point here is it's pretty remarkable why it is that this little child can tell them apart instantly, whereas in a lab it takes a long period of time. And this is because we know that the human body is predominantly made up of one mirror image and not the other mirror image. And much like the way the glove can recognize the hand, the body can recognize the differences between those mirror images. So with this in mind, you can start to understand that this difference in mirror images can start to play a major role when you think about medicine, when you think about drugs. So for example, whenever we have a medicine which is desirable, the mirror image can often be problematic. It can have side effects, it can be toxic. So how are we going to be able to ensure that we make one mirror image without making the other one? Well, we're going to try and use catalysis. So this would now be called asymmetric catalysis. And it's the idea that we can selectively make one mirror image without making the other mirror image. That becomes really, really important. Okay, so the third part is, what does organo mean? What does organo mean in all of this? And to tell you this part of the story, I have to take you back to 1996. Now, Kaz mentioned this in his introduction, but back in 1996, the branches of asymmetric catalysis, there were really just two of them. The first one was biocatalysis, which is using the catalyst of life, of enzymes, to do this asymmetric approach. And the other one was a human-developed system. This was metal catalysis, where we had developed metals to do this kind of chemistry. One of the most successful people in the world is from Japan, who won a Nobel Prize, is Ryoji Naori, for doing metal catalysis, to do exactly this. So at that time, in 1996, moved to Harvard to do my postdoctoral work, and I joined the lab of Dave Evans, one of the most famous organic chemists who ever lived. And the reason why I wanted to join Dave's lab was he and his team were masters in this area of doing metal catalysis. And I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about metal catalysis. And it was an absolutely amazing time. But during that time, I had to work in this contraption. And you probably know this is what you would call a glove box. And in a glove box, as you know, in the inside is a very different environment from the outside. The outside environment is what we have here, but in the inside, there's no oxygen, there's no water, and you have to have that because the metals will not survive on the outside. Now, as a result of this, you practically have to work for many hours a day, every day, in this glove box. And after 2 years of doing this, I started to ask myself, why are we spending so much time in a glove box every single day? Now, if you think about this, and even if you're not a chemist, this is your typical metal catalyst. And even visually, you can see that you can basically break that down the middle, and I'll break it down the middle for you. And if you separate it into the two separate parts, on the right-hand side, we have the metal side. Now, some, but not all, but some metals can be expensive, they can be toxic, they can be difficult to work with, and they're often not sustainable. For example, palladium. At this moment in time, we only have enough palladium on Earth to last another 90 years. That's remarkable when you think we haven't been using it actually for that long. So a lot of metals are just not sustainable. However, if you look on the left-hand side, this is the organic part, and as we all know, organic molecules are inexpensive, they're safe, and they're sustainable. We are all based on organic molecules. We're all part of the life cycle, and as such, they are completely sustainable. And so we started to ask, what if we use only the organic part as the catalyst? And eventually this became known as organocatalysis. Now, at the end of my postdoctoral studies in 1998, I landed a job as an assistant professor, and that was at UC Berkeley. This was at Berkeley, and I really love this photograph. This is my first group in my very first year, and I like it because it's 10 past 10 on a Friday night. You can see this young group in a lab, all working hard, trying to make a difference. So what were we going to work on? Well, we decided we wanted to work on this idea called organocatalysis. And if I haven't mentioned these benefits already, the reasons why, for example, the building blocks to do this were readily available from nature. They're not sensitive to water or air. They're very, very inexpensive. They're easy to handle. You don't have to use these contraptions. And they're non-toxic, they're recyclable, they're completely sustainable. But that wasn't the reason why I was interested in actually doing this. The original reason was actually, would it be possible to develop organic catalysts that work not just for one chemical reaction, but would work for hundreds of different chemical reactions, potentially being a field of asymmetric catalysis. Now, this was a very grandiose idea because, to be honest, at the time, I had no idea on how to do this. This was completely a pipe dream at that moment. But one day in the first year, we're working in the lab, and one of my first students, Tristan Lambert, who's now a very successful professor at Cornell University in the States, he came up to me and he said, what is the mechanism of reductive amination? A very famous reaction in organic chemistry. And being a young professor, I ran to the board to sort of tell him, and I drew up this equation. I said, you take an aldehyde, you take amines, and they reversibly form aminoamines, but it's only when they have an aminoamine configuration it can do the subsequent chemistry. And it was right there, right then, I had the quintessential eureka moment. Because I suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, if you were to take, for example, an alpha-beta unsaturated aldehyde with an amine to form this aminium, that looks very similar to a world of catalysis that had actually been using metals for many decades. So if I actually write this in a far more conventional form, showing here, on the top part, this is called LUMO-lowering catalysis using metals. And there's literally been hundreds of different reactions using this equilibrium. But this bottom one, using organic molecules, there were basically no examples of doing this ever. But if these were really simultaneous equations, that means you could take organic molecules and literally employ them to catalyze hundreds of different reactions. Okay, so we had to choose one to test this on. What were we going to choose? Well, we decided to focus on this reaction, the Diels-Alder reaction. It's probably the most famous chemical reaction, probably the most famous, certainly organic reaction, developed by Diels and Alder, won the Nobel Prize in 1950 because it allows you to take very simple molecules and predictably make much more complex systems and know exactly what you're going to make. So we decided to test this using an organic catalyst. There's the two different molecules we're going to try and combine together. There's the catalyst. This is the organic molecule we're hoping will be the catalyst. And when we ran the reaction, I'll flip to the bottom of the page, and you can see here it says at this bottom, not racemic. Not racemic. What does that mean? Well, not racemic means it makes more of one mirror image than it makes of the other one. This is exactly asymmetric catalysis. And I remember being so excited that I walked out of the lab when I heard this result, went into my office, closed the door, closed the blinds, and I jumped up and down for about 5 minutes because I was so excited. I remember calling my wife back home and saying to her, I think we're going to get tenure. And when you're an assistant professor in America, tenure is a very important thing. So we were very excited about this. But when my feet came back to the ground, we realized there was this number, 48%. What does that mean? Well, that means there was 48% of one mirror image excess over the other mirror image. And if this was really going to be accepted by the chemistry world, this number would have to be close to 90%. So we had to decide, what were we going to do? Were we going to try and improve this reaction? So over the next 6 months, we set out to try and improve it instead of publishing this. It was a very nerve-wracking 6 months. But after 6 months, we came upon a catalyst where we used phenylalanine one of the building blocks of life, amino acid, in combination with acetone. Acetone, as you probably know, is paint stripper. But using that as a catalyst, when we now employed it, we could in fact achieve this reaction with very high levels of success in terms of the amount of one mirror image in preference to the other one. Okay, so this was exciting. Now we had to publish this paper. And the first thing we did when we published the paper was we gave it a name. We called this area organocatalysis. And you might ask, what is in a name? Is a name important? And I can tell you, in science, naming things is extremely important. This is Johann Jakob Berzelius, a very famous Swedish scientist from the 1800s, who actually came up with the name catalysis. He also came up with protein, polymer, isomer, organic, inorganic, lots of the vocabulary we now use every day in chemistry. And naming things is really important. For example, machine learning, AI, directed evolution, nanotechnology, giving the words like organocatalysis really allows people to identify what areas actually exist. So that was important, but probably more important in our first paper was we introduced the concept of a generic activation mode. What does that mean? That sounds very technical. Well, all that means is we're saying that this should work for not just one reaction, this should work for hundreds of different reactions. But the problem was we only actually had performed one reaction. We'd performed this one. And so we went out to test this catalyst to see if it would work for hundreds of reactions. So we tested it, and it went bang, bang, nothing. It just stopped. It stopped after 3 reactions. So this was kind of problematic because we had told the world this was going to work for hundreds of reactions. It's only working for 3. So at this stage, I was very fortunate to have 2 fantastic young graduate students, one called Joel Austin, the other one called Chris Bortz, who performed what I would call precision molecular engineering. And basically, they said, if we remove this 1 carbon from the lower part of this catalyst and take the top part and increase it to 3 carbons, we think this should have an amazing or a beautiful outcome. And to non-chemists, the best way I can explain this is, for example, to show this in football or soccer terms. This is Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who is a precision athlete. He's an incredible athlete who would perform amazing feats in the soccer world. And I'll show you just sort of one example of this. This is a goal that he scored really quickly. He does an overhead kick from 40 yards out and scores a goal. Just an amazing outcome. Just absolutely fantastic. Now, I actually showed this video in my Nobel lecture. And the day after I thought it would be an interesting thing to show. But the next day after my Nobel lecture came out, the British newspapers became very upset. They got very angry. And they said the only reason I showed this goal was because they scored the goal against England. And I think that's very, very, very unfair. But let's watch it one more time. All right, so if we sort of show this, that is an absolutely incredible goal, right? So that's a precision outcome. So the question was, can we do the same thing by changing this catalyst? That was the first generation catalyst. We changed it to the second one, and now this starts to take off like gangbusters. And indeed, you can start to see lots and lots of other people now develop similar catalysts to do lots of even more reactions. So this was really, really exciting for us. Okay, so there's lots of different things that we were able to do with this. We were able to develop aminium. Karl Anker Jorgensen, who's a great scientist, he started to work in this area. At the same time we were doing this, Ben List was actually also working on doing a thing called enamine catalysis with Carlos Barbas. But I also have to point out there was all these wonderful scientists from all over the world who were really involved in doing lots of other chemistry. For example, Keiji Marioka in phase transfer catalysis, people in Lewis base catalysis, nucleophilic catalysis, peptide partial Inouye in that type of chemistry, carbene catalysis, H hydrogen bonding catalysis, and ketone catalysis. And I always like to tell people, I would not be standing on this stage today giving this talk if it wasn't for the contributions of all the people which are actually shown here. Now, this idea of aminium and enamine catalysis was developed. We started to think, can we actually combine these different organocatalytic systems into the same chemical reaction? Now, you might wonder, why would you want to do that? Well, the reason we thought that would be interesting is because that's the way that nature makes very complex molecules. They take simple molecules, and it's almost like a factory assembly line of catalytic processes to generate very complex molecules. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you could do this, not with enzymes, but now actually do it with small molecules? So this is one where we actually took this molecule, which would feed through an aminium, and eventually through an enamine, all in the same reaction vessel, to pop out this molecule at the other side, which is far more complex than the starting material. As it happened, this actually worked, and it worked very well, and it allowed us to make the fastest synthesis of asymmetrically of strychnine that was known to the world. Now, strychnine is a rat poison, so you probably wonder, why would you want to make rat poison? But in organic chemistry, this is what we would call a famous molecular benchmark, because every now and again, people make this molecule to demonstrate the value of the chemical reactions. And this being the fastest allows you to demonstrate the utility of the chemistry that we'd actually developed. Okay, now applications of organocatalysis, and there's a few of those, but I thought I would just pick up and mention just a couple of them for the world's benefit. So the first one is if you think about flavor and fragrances. So if you think about perfume, perfume doesn't sound like a very serious subject, but if you think about the amount of perfume that's used around the world on a daily basis and the energy that goes into making it, it's absolutely incredible. So in partnership with Firmenich, who's a very famous Swiss perfume manufacturing industry, we actually were able to take a way of making now Lily of the Valley and make it in one chemical step. Now, previously, it involved 6 chemical steps. So if you think about the energy savings associated with that, they're absolutely enormous. It's a really, really powerful way to actually be able to do that. And in fact, Firmenich have also used organocatalysis to make a rose-flavored fragrance, which they make on hundreds of ton scale every day, actually, over in India, in northern India, using organocatalysis. Another area that organocatalysis has been useful for is to develop ways to degrade plastics. This is not our work. This is the work of Bob Weymouth and James Hedrick at Stanford and IBM, who've now demonstrated that you can make polymers which have great functionality, but the key part becomes how do you break them back down again so that they're recyclable? And you can now do this, in fact, using organocatalysis, which is a very sustainable way of being able to access these types of molecules. But without question, the number one application of organocatalysis has been for medicines. And there's many different examples of this. In fact, I was at Merck recently. They showed me basically an anti-cancer drug for oncology, which actually involves 3 organocatalytic transformations. But I'll just show you this one. This is Talcegipan. It's a migraine treatment. And Merck actually, using exactly the system that we had developed, they could in fact make one mirror image without making the other one using this form of catalysis, which was obviously something that was wonderful to see. Migraine treatment, it turns out about 3% of the world's population suffers from migraine every single day. Okay, but there was one last advantage of this, which, to be honest with you, we did not see coming. This was something that was not anticipated. And this is now being called democratizing catalysis. And it's basically that organocatalysis is really affordable. It's very inexpensive, and it's therefore very accessible to the world. And as a result of this, on every continent on our planet right now, organocatalysis is taught, but there's also research ongoing on every continent. And one of my favorite parts of this is when people ask me where or what is going to be the next big idea in organocatalysis, I always tell them, I have no idea. I actually have no idea. But the one thing I know is it's not going to be based upon who has the most money. It's going to be based upon who has the best idea. And I think for someone of my own values, that is something which is really fantastic to actually know. Now, upon organocatalysis being developed, we actually started to think about what other types of reactivity can be enabled using this organocatalysis as a foundation. Now, one of the things Kaz mentioned at the beginning, one area that my group has been really interested in for the last 15 years is actually harnessing visible light. As you probably know, inorganic chemists have been really focused upon the idea of how do you capture solar energy to power our planet? How do you go about doing that? And over the last 4 decades, they've developed all these wonderful catalysts that are becoming more and more successful at achieving that goal. But along the way, they created lots of really interesting knowledge, lots of really interesting ideas. And based on that, we started to get interested in the idea, could you actually take those ideas and those catalysts and not use them for inorganic chemistry, could you actually use them for organic? So this, in and of itself, became sort of known as photoredox catalysis. This is now using, for example, blue light to perform chemical reactions. Now, there's a lot of reasons why using blue light is actually pretty interesting. I'll show you one of the first things we ever did. This was Dave Nasevich. He was a postdoc in my group who performed the first photoredox reaction. And it was really simple. And the idea was if you combine these organic molecules and you use visible light, you would be using two of the most sustainable forms of both catalysis and energy to achieve any given synthetic organic transformation. And in fact, simply by shining on these blue lights, we can now achieve chemical reactions that were previously impossible. And what's really interesting, if you don't have the light, these just will not work. Okay, now, as that happens, so organocatalysis in and of itself, which has become a relatively large field, this actually became for us the field of photoredox catalysis. And while those two different areas might seem quite different from each other, it's unquestionable in my mind, without organocatalysis, we would have never got to this field of photoredox. And photoredox in and of itself has actually become an even bigger field than organocatalysis. So over the last couple of decades, probably the last 15 years, one of the questions that people ask me a lot about photoredox is why did it become so popular? Why is it in chemistry it's now so heavily utilized? And I think the answer is pretty straightforward. It's because in organic chemistry, these are the type of molecules which are widely available. We would call these feedstock chemicals. They're widely available all over the world in lots of different structural dimensions and lots of different diversity. But for the most part, they're very unreactive, which is obviously important. You want them to be unreactive. That's why they're so broadly available. But because they're so widely available, it would be wonderful if we could somehow use them and use them in new ways. Now, one of the benefits we've realized with photoredox is these catalysts shown here. This is one of those catalysts. And for example, if I was to take my hand and shine this blue laser pointer on my hand, I could do that all day long. And I would not hurt my hand because blue light is very mild, obviously. Now, I look a bit strange doing it, but it's not going to hurt me. However, if I shine a blue light into this reaction vessel, this catalyst will selectively absorb the photon, and the catalyst will become the equivalent of 32,000 degrees Celsius, while every other molecule in the vessel is at room temperature. Now, these catalysts don't give away their energy and heat up the vessel. What they do is they either give off another photon or they selectively react with these molecules that are around them. And when they do, they make these very high energy species selectively in the vessel. Now remember, these are feedstock chemicals that were previously difficult to activate, and we can now, just using blue light, make them highly, highly, highly reactive. So with this in mind, we've now been able to take those and been able to utilize them to devise lots of new chemical reactions. And once again, the major benefactor of this has been the pharmaceutical industry. This has really changed the way people think about going about doing drug discovery, because it allows you to dramatically change the shape and the size and the types of molecules that you're using for medicine. One of the things that pharmaceutical companies care a lot about is trying to move things further and further and further through the clinic towards success. As it happens, to do that, it's correlated with having a thing called sp3 carbons. But the pharmaceutical industry for the last 3 decades hasn't used a lot of those types of carbons. This now allows you to do exactly that. All right, now, what does the future hold for organocatalysis? Well, as I said earlier, I don't think I can actually predict that, but I think one of the things you can predict is we move their populations, as they continue to grow, we're going to have to come up with more and more responsible ways and more sustainable ways of doing catalysis. And that's why we need young scientists like yourself. There are so many potential opportunities to devise new ways of doing catalysis, and we're going to have to invent them, no matter what. For example, for climate change, that is one aspect of climate change that we have to do. We have to invent a new type of catalysis to do that. The types of catalysts we can use are things like organocatalysis, biocatalysis, photocatalysis, electrocatalysis. And although I told you this, you can't use some metals, there are definitely other metals you can use, the base metals, things which are widely available. Okay, so that's the last part of the science I'm going to tell. I always like to finish my talk by thanking my family. This is my daughters, 3 daughters. This is us actually on the Harbour Bridge in Sydney in Australia. I always tell people, you know, clearly I believe that education and science is a passport to the world. You know, I think I've been to Japan 25 times now in my life, and I certainly wouldn't have even left Scotland if it wasn't for science and for education. It's just remarkable what science and education can do for your life in all the different places around the world it will take you. I also have to thank my wife, who's here with me today. She's been amazing at supporting us through all of this. And then lastly, I always finish off by thanking my mom and dad. After I won the Nobel Prize and they gave us the prize money, I decided I didn't want to keep the prize money, so we created a foundation which now funds underprivileged people, kids mainly, teenagers in Scotland to go to university and stay in university. And what was really wonderful about that was after we announced this, it was actually a story that was picked up by the BBC, and it went kind of viral all over the world, which was fantastic because a lot of people subsequently contributed to this fund. And so every year now, we make a donation to various organizations across Scotland, and it's been wonderful to see that actually to happen. Lastly, again, it's been a remarkable privilege to be here, and I'd love to talk to all of you at some point if you're interested in chatting with me, and I really appreciate your attention this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Dave. Wonderful talk, and I recognize again you are a humorous person. So I want to open the question and discussion session. So if you have question, please stand in front of the 2 microphones, and please identify your name and affiliation. Don't hesitate. So as you know, Dave is a nice person, so don't hesitate to ask question to him.
People from my group only say I'm a nice person after they leave the group.
Thank you for talking. My question is also first catalyst methylproline, methyl ester proline, and next catalyst. So design is so different. Why so you make the secondary amine catalyst?
That's a great question. So the question is, for a chemist, if you see the first one is proline, and the second one doesn't look like proline, how do you get from one to the other? And I think I said it, but probably not strongly. There was 6 months between that one and that one. But what we realized during that 6 months, and for those of you who are not chemists, when you form those aminoamides, they actually can form 2 different aminoamides. One, it points one way, one, it points the other way. You think, so what? But if you don't control which way it points, you can't control which mirror image you're making. So what we had to do was come up with a catalyst that would force the aminium to only form one of the 2. And by doing that, it would then control which mirror image we generate. So that control part, it was a really nice design, and we would make different catalysts, and they would kind of work, but not quite there, until we got to the one that I showed. And it's probably hard for many of you to remember, but I had 2 methyls on one side and just a benzyl on the other. And those 2 methyls forced the aminium to be formed the other way. So that's why we had to do that. But it wasn't as straightforward as I made it sound. It literally was 6 months to enable that to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Professor MACMILLAN, for your presentation. I am Kedar Dakal from Nepal, and I work with polymer science. And regarding your presentation about organocatalysis regarding the plastic recycling, May I ask one question regarding this? You mean plastic recycling only or plastic degradation as well using organocatalysis?
So it's basically what they're doing is they're inventing monomers to become new types of polymers, which the organic catalyst can then lead to them being effectively broken back down again. So it's not recycling of polystyrene per se, which it's kind of interesting though, people are now using photoradars to do the recycling of polystyrene and things like that through introduction of oxidative components which will then do beta scission. This is actually where you're designing polymers which are then subsequently are ready to be broken back down again.
Will it be possible for plastic degradation using organocatalysis, complete degradation as well?
It really depends. So the one part which is important is when you degrade, as you know, if you degrade any polymer, it's always going to be based upon what are the bonds that you're breaking and how you're doing it selectively. To do that means that you have to channel energy to a given bond, usually CH, to make it into a hydroxyl, which you can then do beta scission from. To do that using an organic catalyst might be possible using, for example, N-oxides, but the cheaper way of even doing it beyond organocatalysis is going to be light, because light's extraordinarily inexpensive, as you know. So if you can literally do it with light now, that's going to make current photocatalysts actually be more likely to be degraded.
My last question, quite a general question. Can we expect about green catalysis in this regard as well?
Can you expect what, sorry?
Green catalysis.
Green catalysis. This is, we don't call it green catalysis for a whole range of different reasons, but it's obviously green catalysis. I think almost any form of catalysis going forward for production of molecules on scale is going to have to involve green catalysis. However, the thing that people forget, there is this thing called discovery catalysis. For example, any medicine that you would take in the next 10 to 15 years, if it's a small molecule, at some point it was discovered using discovery catalysis. Discovery catalysis doesn't actually need to be green. It would be preferable, but it's not actually going to harm the planet to be green. But when it comes to then make enough of it for society, then it has to be green. So I think what you're really seeing as we think about, as we move forward for sustainable for the world, the new catalytic concepts we need to develop have to mainly be green. They have to be sustainable.
Thank you very much.
The gray jacket.
So I'm Masaya Sakakibara from the University of Tokyo. So first of all, thank you for your stimulating talk. And I know your chemistry, and I think that you made up a number of unique concepts, including thermal activation or organocatalysis. So what was the source of your imagination? So what makes you so unique?
That's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I don't think I'm very unique at all. I think I'm just a very average sort of Scottish person, to be completely honest. I don't, it's one of those things that, I'm sure this is true of a lot of people in the front row that keeps you up at night, is wondering how this sort of happened to you and how is this all sort of playing out. I think the thing, if I had to say anything that makes me slightly different, is that I think I get very, this is a terrible thing to say, but I get very bored with what we know already. And so I think I'm always trying to figure out a new way of doing something. And a lot of times that fails. It fails 99 times out of 100 to try and do new things. But every now and again, something works, right? And so for me, I think it's more of the always trying to find, it's maybe just another word for curiosity, but you're trying to find new ways of doing things that don't exist right now. I think for me, that's probably the exciting thing. But I'm sure that's true. That's probably true of everyone in this room, though, to be completely honest.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Professor MACMILLAN. This is Indranil Dev from India. So in one of the places you said, you gave a definition that photoredox catalysis, where you said that it is a use of the visible light to mediate the transfer of electrons. So my question is that, can we use electric field, or let's say some millivolts, to promote this thing? Then in that case, we can use the bioelectricity then to catalyze.
That's an absolutely wonderful question. And so the electric field component to move electrons might be difficult and maybe not have the driving force which is required. But electric field to control selectivity in what those molecules can do is absolutely realistic. And it's never been realized. Now, you're beginning to see lots of very young scientists think about this problem. And I think that's, I mean, it's always dangerous to predict the future, but I think that's going to be a really exciting area for the future, is how can you use electric fields to change the outcomes of the molecules that you're excited about. I think that's absolutely going to happen.
Thank you, sir.
Hi.
So I'm Omar Drame from Senegal, and first of all, I want to thank you for the quality of the lecture, and you show us that research is not a jail. You have to be free.
Right.
So we are very happy for this. And my question is, I'm working in the solar side, okay? And the photo absorber, I want to know exactly the photocatalyzer, you can use it for heating or something like that.
Yeah, so you can. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely use it for other things. I mean, obviously you can use it for Dexter energy transfer. There's other things you can use it for too. The electron transfer thing is really, really interesting to both inorganic and organic chemistry, because most of classically how we've been taught to think about chemistry has been with anions and cations, right? Positive and minus. But nature actually does so much of what nature does with free radicals, because it controls them using these large biomolecules. And I'd say it's only in the last probably 10 years, we've been doing radical chemistry for 100 years, but it's only in the last 10 years that we're really starting to figure out how to control these radicals. And radicals open up this other world of ways of making molecules. It really has been just a whole different chapters that's moving forward. So I think you can now see it's not just photochemistry, it's also electrochemistry. There's all these other aspects of it which are really, really important right now. So I definitely think that's the case. So you're from Senegal? Yeah, so my daughter, who I showed you, the little 3-year-old, so she's now in Senegal, actually working in Senegal right now, yeah.
It's a nice country.
So she keeps telling me she loves it over there, so we should talk later.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Hi. I'm Lee from Sililan Hospital, Mahidol University, Bangkok, Thailand. I will have just one question. What is your perspective on organocatalytics in the cancer chemotherapy to reduce the toxics or get more sustainable to friendly use for the patients?
Well, I mean, so the one thing you keep in mind about what organocatalysis does, it allows you to access molecules. But I would argue that there's a lot of people in the front row who are much better experts to address this than I am, although we certainly work in that area now. But in oncology, there's really been all these new approaches which have been coming along to try and address ways of thinking about oncology based on biological mechanisms that have not been exploited as much as they could have been in the past, which is normal. That's what science does. So everything from immuno-oncology all the way through to degrader oncology. There's also these new areas that people are becoming more and more excited about, is how do you basically effectively, for example, go after mutants? How do you go after a mutant enzyme in oncology using the residue functionality that's there that's not there in the normal tissue? So there's all of these biological mechanisms which are coming to the fore which will impact biology. But what organocatalysis and photoredox does, it enables you to make the three-dimensional space so much faster than you could before and have a much higher likelihood of having clinical success. The clinical success part is because you're now potentially removing the problems that arise from what's called flatland. Flatland is when we use aromatic molecules to bind to enzyme targets. And while they're fantastic at binding, they come with a lot of associated problems. But when you start to introduce strained organic molecules with sp3 carbons, they don't have those problems, but they're much more difficult to make. What this allows you to do is to access the molecules to test these biological questions.
Thank you.
Good morning, Prof. There was a very remarkable speech on catalysis just now. So my question is, because previously I was researching on the transition metal catalysis, and I'm actually very interested in the field of catalysis due to the use of various nature available materials and building blocks. So may I know, do you have any advice for the transition of metal catalysis to organocatalysis?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if I would be the best person to give you advice. I mean, I would just say that, you know, do what you're excited about. You know, if it's metal catalysis and there's ways that you think that you can have exciting ideas there and you're excited about them, that's all that really matters. So think about what it is that gets you excited. The one thing I would say is don't necessarily move into fields because fields exist. I would say, if anything, try and think about what do you think is missing? If you look around and you learn about all these different scientific areas, what is not there? And try and think about that. And that might be, for you, an exciting way to think about what you could do in the future. But sometimes going into fields that already exist is okay, but there's usually lots and lots of people who've done lots of things already. Doesn't mean to say it's exhausted, but it's always fun to try and go and play in an area where no one else is there already. That's really exciting.
Thank you very much.
This is Zhou Yang from Beijing, China, a physician and a virologist. So it's kind of like a general question. I really appreciate your point that naming is very important in science. Like when you name a new thing and you create a new field and others would come to join. So like also for me, I studied COVID. So the virus was named like novel coronavirus and then other like different sorts of names and then finally settled down to SARS coronavirus 2.
Right.
So my question would be, what were your thoughts when you name like a new thing? Because usually it was like difficult to give a new name.
Oh yeah, no, for me it was probably just out of laziness because when I was writing the articles, I was just, the words that people would use for it was metal-free or non-metal catalysis. And it seemed weird to name something after something it was not, right? It was kind of strange. So I thought we had to come up with a proactive terminology. And when we said the word organocatalysis, it seemed like an easy word to say and an easy word to sort of runs off the tongue. And it just sort of stuck. And I think that's also important. Like, you know, when you say words like nanotechnology or AI or machine learning, you know, people don't really say artificial intelligence anymore because it's too much of a mouthful. When you say AI, everyone is happy with it. So although it sounds kind of less substantial, naming things is incredibly important. And I also think communicating things is incredibly important as well. I think if you can't communicate the science well, you miss the audience. And you could have the greatest idea in the world, and it might not be, you may have discovered it, but the world might not discover it because you haven't communicated it. So I do think all of that sort of fits together.
Thank you.
It will be last question from you.
Hello, Prof. My name is Vanessa, and I'm from South Africa. So my question is, most organic synthesis involves the use of toxic solvents. So I want to know, how did you deal with disposing those toxic solvents? And moreover, those synthesis methods, they usually take a lot of time to do. So I wanted to know, how long did it take for you to produce your organocatalyst? Yes.
Yeah, okay. So basically, that's a great question. So one of the bigger issues is the nature of the solvents. If you're a non-chemist and you don't know what a solvent is, the solvent is the liquid that you use to run the reaction in, but the solvent is basically inert. It's only there to let the molecules find each other. But they do have interesting properties, although most of those properties are still not very well understood. The way I describe this to undergraduates when I'm first teaching them, it's a bit like if you had a washing machine and you had to put in detergent but not add water, the detergent would never get to the clothes, it would just be a mess. But if you add water, the water allows the detergent to get to the clothes. That's what a solvent does. The problem is, so many of the solvents we use are not good for the earth. So organic catalysts are pretty unique, actually, and you can generally use them in water. And there's a really interesting philosophical question. If we had never invented solvents, and we'd only ever invented chemistry that worked in water, would be more advanced as a population now than we are right now. And there's a pretty good argument that we might be, actually, if we'd actually did that. So it's something that I think chemistry has to work on for the future, is to really focus upon just chemical reactions that work in water. That's what nature does. So the question is, how do we do the same, and what kind of catalysts are going to allow us to do that? Obviously, organic catalysts can do it, biocatalysis can do it. Metals suffer, but not impossible. But that's definitely a really interesting area. The second question, real fast, it's so simple to make those catalysts. You literally take acetone and phenylalanine and mix them together and heat them up, and you make the catalyst. So very, very easy to make.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's time to close this session. So please join me to appreciate Professor Dave MACMILLAN.
Thank you very much, Dr. McMillan and Dr. Nagao. Let's show our appreciation with a round of applause.